We are taught to believe that courage wins wars. We are told that when a small group of human beings stands against an overwhelming force, it is their undying spirit, their unyielding bravery, or some divine fire that carries them through the slaughter. That is a lie in the cold reality of absolute conflict. Bravery is completely irrelevant. Courage cannot stop a piece of sharpened iron from tearing through flesh, and it cannot prevent a wave of human bodies from physically crushing you under their collective weight. When a tiny force defeats an enemy 5, 10, or 20 times its size, they do not do it with spirit. They do it with math. They do it by transforming a chaotic display of violence into a highly predictable clinical calculation. Survival is not a question of character, it is a question of coordinates. To understand how an extreme deficit can be systematically weaponized, you must first look at how we perceive danger. When an individual is confronted by a massive crowd of adversaries, the human brain instantly performs a primitive calculation. It tallies the sheer volume of the threat, contrasts it with its own isolation, and triggers an overwhelming chemical command to run. This is not cowardice, it is basic evolutionary programming. For millions of years, safety meant scale. The larger herd always survives the smaller predator, but a tactical commander does not look at an army as a collection of angry living beings. To the architect of the line, an invading force is simply uncompressed matter. It is fluid volume that takes up physical space, obeys the laws of kinetics, and exerts a specific amount of mechanical pressure per square meter. The moment you strip away the flags, the screaming, and the terrifying armor, you are left with a raw engineering problem. The objective is no longer to outfight the enemy, but to alter the space they are permitted to occupy. This brings us to the core mechanism of spatial control, the deliberate exploitation of density. In an open landscape, numbers are an absolute god. A massive force will inevitably expand sideways, wrapping around a smaller opponent like a rising tide. The moment the edges of your line are bypassed, the space behind you becomes compromised. Once a soldier realizes he must defend his front and his rear simultaneously, his internal psychological architecture collapses. He is no longer fighting to hold a position, he is fighting to escape a trap. Therefore, the entire science of defensive warfare relies on a single uncompromising mandate. You must eliminate the open air. The commander must look across the landscape and find a location where the earth rises up to act as a permanent, unbreakable boundary. This is where the terrain becomes the primary actor in the equation. It could be a steep limestone corridor, a deeply eroded riverbed, or a narrow clearing flanked by bottomless mire. By anchoring both ends of a defensive formation against these impassable physical constraints, the commander achieves something extraordinary. They completely erase the concept of the flank. By removing the outer space, you fundamentally change the nature of the math. If a natural defile is only wide enough for 30 men to stand shoulder to shoulder, it ceases to matter if the enemy has brought 5,000 or 50,000 men to the field. The vast majority of that massive host is instantly reduced to a completely passive audience. They cannot swing a weapon, they cannot exert a force, and they cannot see what is happening at the front. At any given millisecond, the ratio is no longer thousands against hundreds. It is 30 against 30. The macro deficit has been forcefully compressed into a localized micro-equilibrium. Imagine a concrete example of this mechanical breakdown. Picture a narrow, deeply sunken trail cutting through an unstable ridge of loose shale. On one side, the rock face rises vertically into the sky. On the other, it drops off into a jagged canyon. Into this throat, a commander places a highly disciplined formation of just 400 men. They are packed together in a tight geometric grid. Their shields are locked rim to rim, creating a continuous, unbroken wall of oak and bronze. Behind the front rank, 4 deeper rows of men press their bodies directly against the backs of their comrades. Now look at the attacking force. They arrive at the mouth of the ridge with 5,000 soldiers. They are flush with the confidence of overwhelming scale. They look down the narrow path, see the tiny contingent blocking their way, and unleash a massive, disorganized charge. They believe that their sheer momentum will simply wash over the defenders like a wave over sand. But as the front ranks of the charging force slam into the shield wall, something jarring happens. The kinetic energy of their run is not absorbed by individual men. Because the defenders are packed chest to back, the shockwave of the impact is distributed evenly throughout the entire depth of the 400-man block. The line does not buckle, it acts as a singular, solid mass of immense structural density. The attackers do not break through. Instead, they bounce off the wall, their momentum instantly neutralized by the cold physics of structural bracing. And this is where the system takes an incredibly dark, counterintuitive turn. The real danger to a defensive line does not come from the enemy's weapons. It comes from the line working too perfectly. As the front rank of the attacking force is halted mid-stride, the thousands of men behind them do not stop. They cannot see the shield wall. They only know that the column has moved forward and their instructions are to push. The massive weight of the rear ranks begins to press heavily into the backs of their own front line. The people at the front are now trapped between two immovable objects: the solid stone ridge of the shield wall before them and the blind, forward-surging mass of their own army behind them. The space inside the choke point becomes terrifyingly constricted. The attackers lose the ability to raise their arms to strike. Their elbows are pinned to their ribs by the sheer lateral pressure of their comrades. The very air is squeezed from their lungs. What began as a glorious, aggressive advance transforms in a matter of minutes into a slow, claustrophobic nightmare of self-inflicted suffocation. The larger army is actively committing suicide using its own kinetic energy. This reveals the profound psychological leverage of absolute spatial discipline. Human beings are hardwired to maintain a certain amount of personal space around their bodies. When that space is violently taken away, the conscious mind shuts down and the primitive survival instinct takes over. In a compressed crowd, individuals stop operating as tactical units or teammates. They begin to fight each other simply to find room to breathe. They climb over the fallen, push their friends aside, and compromise their own safety just to relieve the agonizing physical pressure. The commander of the defensive line understands this exact behavior pattern. They do not need their 400 men to perform acrobatic feats of martial arts. They do not need them to be aggressive. They only need them to act as a highly synchronized piston. A mechanical, rhythmic cycle of short, controlled thrusts into the paralyzed mass of flesh in front of them, followed by a collective step forward to reclaim an inch of bloodied earth. The bodies of the fallen accumulate at the feet of the defenders, creating an artificial, slippery mound that further disrupts the balance of the next wave of attackers. The geometry of the space has completely weaponized the enemy's scale against their own survival. When you analyze this dynamic from a purely structural standpoint, a shocking realization takes hold. The side with the massive numerical advantage is actually the side experiencing the highest level of instability. A massive army requires immense space to maintain its internal organization, its communication lines, and its psychological coherence. The moment you strip that space away, the entire system fractures from within. The larger the mass, the more catastrophic the collapse when it is forced into a space that cannot accommodate its volume. The ultimate legacy of the SHIELD formula is not found in the tactical manuals of the ancient world, nor is it confined to the muddy valleys of forgotten conflicts. It is a fundamental truth about how human systems interact with constraint. We consistently mistake scale for power and volume for security. We build massive organizations, launch massive initiatives, and rely on sheer numbers to overwhelm our problems, forgetting that the more complex and bloated a structure becomes, the more vulnerable it is to a highly focused, mathematically optimized resistance. When the dust finally settles on the sunken ridge, the landscape reveals a scene that completely defies conventional human expectation. The 400 defenders still occupy the exact same coordinate they were assigned at dawn. Their lines are intact, their breathing is controlled, and their minds are clear. In front of them lies a monument of chaotic ruin, constructed entirely out of an army that believed its victory was guaranteed by the arithmetic of the roster. It was never a fair fight because numbers are a fluid illusion. Space, geometry, and the absolute control of human instinct are the only things that remain absolute. When you control the space, you dictate the terms of existence. And when you draw that single, uncompromising line in the dirt, you remind the world that a deficit is only a death sentence to those who do not know how to count.